Imagine a gate bolted across a narrow track, a padlock like a shilling of metal against the quiet. Beside it, an official stamp, neat, bureaucratic, on a pale sheet of paper. No human remains found. The excavation is closed. The field crew signs off. The ledger for the season is stamped and filed. The dig is over. Now imagine opening the drawer where that ledger should live and finding a hole. Empty space where notebooks, context sheets, photographs, film negatives, the chain of custody log should sit. Nothing. Not misfiled paper, not a single label with a catalog number. Just the faint shadow of where those documents belonged. If you work in archaeology, museum curation, or in any field that depends on chains of evidence, that double image is more than an aesthetic puzzle. It is a methodological crisis. An empty site sealed with official authority is one thing, but an empty archive that should confirm, contradict, or at least explain that declaration changes the terms of the mystery entirely. The ledger ought to tell us why someone declared, "No human remains found." Its absence raises the question we will carry through this investigation. Empty site plus missing records, what happened? This is not a story that begins with proof. It begins with a gap that needs explaining, and with the careful work of cataloging what is absent as much as what remains. My aim here is to walk through that work, to show why absence matters, how archaeology establishes facts, and what plausible scenarios could produce the pair of silences, the field and the archives. Along the way, we'll look at parallel cases from the recent and deep past, cases where the reasons for absence were mundane, tragic, ceremonial, or exceptional. I will sketch hypotheses and the sorts of evidence that would support or rule them out. Where I speculate, I will say so. Before we go further, a short note. If this subject interests you and you'd like a dossier of source material and further reading, subscribe, and you'll find links to primary reports, papers, and archival standards in the accompanying notes. Why the declaration matters. Archaeology is at its core an argument constructed from fragments. The discipline depends on meticulous contemporaneous recording. When an archaeologist trowels a layer, they do so with a pencil and a set of forms. Context sheets that define the soil unit, sketches and plans that place the find in three-dimensional space, a field notebook with observations, photographs that freeze an in situ moment, and labeled bags that hold fragments away from contamination. Those labels carry accession numbers that, once entered into a catalog, connect a bone or potsherd to reports, to a place on a site map, to radiocarbon dates in a lab log. If any link in that chain is broken, our ability to reconstruct what happened at the place and time under study weakens. If multiple links are missing, the reconstruction may collapse into competing hypotheses with little way to adjudicate them. Beyond science, those documents are the social memory of the people who stood at that trench. Descendant communities, legal claimants, and governments may rely on an excavation's records to decide repatriation, preservation, or even criminal investigations. Museum accession registers and context sheets can be evidence in court or instruments of justice for communities who seek answers about the past. An empty declaration, backed by a complete archive, is an accountable statement. An empty declaration without records is an open wound. There is another reason absence is meaningful. Archaeologists have long recognized that absence can be data. The absence of bodies in a burned settlement might signal evacuation. The absence of armaments in a fortification's remains might indicate it was ceremonial from the start. The absence of human remains in a mass burial context might tell a story of rapid pandemic burials rather than carefully ritualized internment. To interpret absence well, we rely on the comparative archive. In other words, on the record of how sites like this one look when certain processes are at work. That is why, in the case that begins this investigation, the missing records are not an incidental curiosity. They are the key to interpreting whether empty means evacuated, never occupied by the living in that way, looted, never documented, or something more troubling. The mechanics of archaeological evidence. What should be there to understand how glaring an empty archive is? You have to picture what should exist after a modern excavation. The list that follows is not exhaustive, but it captures the essentials. a field notebook for each context or square, kept by the archaeologist who supervised that area. These notebooks carry observations about the soil color and texture, about finds in situ, and about decisions taken during excavation. Context sheets. These are standardized forms that number stratigraphic units and describe their relationships. What sits above what, where cuts and fills occur. Good context sheets enable the construction of a Harris matrix, the diagram archaeologists use to visualize stratigraphic sequence. Plans and sections, measured drawings of trenches and features, usually at a fixed scale, pinned to grid references. These show where artifacts and features were found relative to a coordinate system. Photographic records. Overall site photos, mid-range images, close-ups, and single object shots with scale. Historically, this involved negatives or slides. In modern practice, digital files plus backups. Finds bags and labels. Every object, bone, or sample is bagged and labeled with a unique accession number tied back to the context sheet. Sample logs for radiocarbon dating, stable isotopes, or other lab work. These show what material was submitted, how it was processed, and what dates or results were returned. Laboratory reports and correspondence between the excavation team and specialists, osteologists, palynologists, soil analysts, who provide interpretation of finds. Accession registers at the holding institution, university department, museum, or ministry archive, detailing when and how objects were curated. Administrative records, permits, field director sign-offs, letters of agreement with landowners and local authorities, and the final report that synthesizes field observations. Chain of custody documents, where appropriate, showing who handled sensitive materials and how they were transported and stored. When those items are present and coherent, they enable cross-checking. A photograph can verify a context description. A radiocarbon date tied to a labeled sample can place a layer in time. A catalog number makes an individual bone traceable from field trowel to museum shelf to published figure. When any of these elements vanish, the remaining elements stand alone and are weak evidence at best. A quick definition, because the term will recur, taphonomy. Taphonomy is the study of what happens to organic remains from the moment of death, or from the moment they are deposited, until discovery. It includes decay, animal action, chemical change, scattering by environmental forces, and human activity. Taphonomy matters because the differential survival of material creates patterns that archaeologists interpret. A site that yields zero human bone may simply be a place where preservation conditions were terrible. Acidic soils dissolve bone. Or the bones may have been relocated by animal gnawing, water movement, or human removal. These are the possibilities we will have to weigh against one another in the pages of this investigation. Analogs. How other sites illuminate absence. There are a number of well-documented cases that help us build a taxonomy of plausible explanations for a declared absence. None of these cases is the titular site. They are here to illuminate mechanisms and to show what kinds of evidence each mechanism tends to leave behind. Consider Akrotiri, on the island of Santorini. The Bronze Age settlement there was buried under volcanic ash from the Minoan eruption. The ash sealed buildings, frescoes, and furniture in place. It preserved the architecture in remarkable detail, but left no human skeletons in situ. The prevailing interpretation is that the population evacuated before the worst of the eruption, or that any human remains have long since been removed or degraded. Archaeologists studying Akrotiri point to beds and household items left intact as material traces consistent with hurried departure, rather than mass death on the spot. This is a powerful example of an empty site where absence was not evidence of non-existence, but of evacuation. Contrast that with burial contexts like the Hal Saflieni hypogeum in Malta, an underground necropolis where human remains were deliberately placed and rearranged over generations. The hypogeum preserves a record of ritualized deposition, bones in certain chambers, skulls with traces of intent, and stratigraphic complexity that shows repeated use. Here, absence in one chamber can indicate repeated redistribution. The social practice of treating the dead becomes part of the taphonomic picture. The key lesson: Cultural practices can produce unexpected patterns of presence and absence that only make sense within a proper documented sequence of action. Then there are bog bodies, studied in depth by scholars such as P.V. Glob. In Northern Europe, acidic peat has preserved soft tissue and skin in contexts where ordinary burial would not. Tollandman and his counterparts show that exceptional preservation can produce the opposite problem. Bodies unexpectedly present in contexts where we would otherwise expect none. If you find one peat-preserved corpse, the presence of that body is decisive. If you find none in peat but the expectation was for preservation, that absence can be diagnostic of different depositional histories. At the other end of the spectrum, consider the human remains from the Atapuerca caves, including the Grandolina assemblage. The evidence there is fragmentary, complex, and contentious. Cut marks, fragmented bones, and patterns some interpret as signs of cannibalism or complicated taphonomic histories. The point is not to settle those debates here, but to show how microevidence, tiny striations on a bone, the angle of percussion, can overturn sweeping narratives. The lesson for our empty case is processual. Small traces matter enormously, and their absence because no one recorded them can make a past impossible to reconstruct. The discovery of the Tong child by Raymond Dart provides another instructive example of how a single specimen can reshape narratives. A single, well-documented find, recorded with care, can become a touchstone for debate and eventually consensus because the contextual information anchors interpretation. Conversely, the loss of such documentation relegates a find to ambiguity. High-altitude Inca sacrifices, such as those on Lulailico documented by archaeologists including Johann Reinhard, show how context and preservation shape interpretation. Children intentionally placed on mountain summits were preserved by cold and dryness. Their context, artifacts placed with them, the ritual positioning, makes their sacrificial character clear. If the record were lost, those bodies could be misinterpreted as something else entirely. Finally, institutional responses to catastrophe create a different class of absence. In London, the East Smithfield mass burials associated with the Black Death show how emergency public health imperatives can change both the mortality pattern and the recording practice. Rapid burial, minimal documentation, and the repurposing of existing spaces can produce a heavy archaeological signal, mass graves, but a light documentary footprint. From this set of parallels, we can begin to assemble a taxonomy of mechanisms that produce emptiness. Evacuation before disaster. Structures preserved but no bodies. Material culture suggests hurried departure. Ritual deposition or redistribution. Bodies or skulls moved as part of social practice, creating absences in expected contexts. Exceptional preservation in unusual contexts. Peat, cold, desiccation, can preserve where normal soil would not. Taphonomic loss. Acidic soils, scavengers, and water can remove organic remains. Emergency or mass disposal. Rapid interment with poor documentation due to crisis. Human removal, rescue, relocation for reburial, looting, or clandestine removal for illicit markets. Archival loss. Paperwork destroyed by fire, flood, war, misfiling, or technological obsolescence. Deliberate suppression, powerful institutions concealing records, a hypothesis that requires extraordinary evidence. Each of these mechanisms makes different demands of the evidence. Evacuation may leave traces in architecture and household placement. Ritual deposition may leave patterned clustering of elements and associated artifacts. Taphonomic loss is often detectable through soil chemistry and micromorphology. Looting can be suggested by disturbed contexts, the sudden absence of higher-value artifacts, and a pattern of holes or clandestine trenches. Archival loss is a meta-problem. It can be signaled by administrative discontinuities, transfers of responsibility without documentation, or known disasters at holding institutions. Archival forensics. How records die. If the field record is missing, the archive is the place to start. But archives are not immune. They live in rooms with roofs and pipes and staff schedules. A catalog card is no guarantee of permanence. Paper warps, ink fades, and entire collections can be misplaced in transfers between institutions. Records become orphaned when excavation directors retire or die, and no institutional memory persists. There are several common failure modes that archivists and museum professionals warn about. Misfiling. In busy collections, a ledger can be misfiled under a different accession year, a different site code, or even mixed with unrelated materials during rehousing. Lack of digitization. Many older projects were documented on paper and negative film. If those materials were never digitized, the only surviving copies rest on shelves in a climate-controlled room. Or they rested there until a flood, fire, insect infestation, or neglect destroyed them. Transferal without inventory. Excavations often start as university projects and later transfer finds to national museums. If the transfer occurs without a full inventory, the trail can go cold in the handoff. Disaster, floods, fires, and war have destroyed archives with cruel finality. Historical examples abound, most famously, library and manuscript losses in wars and urban fires. But the lesson is simple. Unique primary records are vulnerable. Administrative pruning. Budget crises sometimes lead institutions to deaccession low-priority material, especially documents thought to be duplicative. A clearing exercise might dispose of negatives and field notes that, to short-sighted administrators, seemed expendable. Intentional removal. In rare cases, individuals with access may remove or destroy records. Proving such action is difficult without backups or external corroboration. Technological obsolescence. Photographic slides, tapes, storage media, and early digital formats can become unreadable if not migrated. A set of DAT tapes or a hard drive with a proprietary format can be as inaccessible as a burned ledger. None of these failure modes is fanciful. They are well documented in the professional literature on archival stewardship. Each produces a different signature. Misfiling creates discontinuities in cataloging. Disaster often produces a cluster of losses centered on a time and place. Intentional removal tends to leave oddities. Fully coherent stock of everything except one file. Chain of custody is crucial here. In forensic archaeology, knowing who handled a sample and how it moved from field to lab is essential. The chain is recorded in tags, in signed manifests, in transfer forms. If those links are missing, you cannot reliably tie a lab date to a particular context. For example, a radiocarbon date reported in a lab ledger is useless without the sample number that connects it to a context sheet. When an institution tells you, there are no dates for that trench, you must ask, did they never submit samples? Did the lab lose the records? Or did the accession number never make the trip into the catalog? What would each scenario actually look like? We can be a bit more concrete by asking, for each hypothesized mechanism, what residual evidence we would expect, and which kinds of missing or surviving records would either support or contradict it. If evacuation is the best explanation, we will typically find intact domestic interiors, beds, household objects in place, foodstuffs or storage jars, and architectural features sealed by ash or collapse that suggest sudden abandonment. We would expect the field record to show dense cultural deposits with little in the way of human bone. Photographs should capture in situ items arranged as if left in haste. If those photographs and context sheets are missing, the logical path is to seek secondary documentation, contemporary newspaper accounts, the director's published reports, or even foreign archives where slides might have been deposited. If deliberate removal, whether rescue of remains for reburial, lawful exhumation for religious reasons, or illicit looting, is on the table, the field record will often show disturbed layers, clandestine trenches, or sudden gaps in artifact assemblages where high-value objects are missing. Reports of artifacts appearing on the market, unaccompanied by provenance, would also be relevant. But here we must be cautious. Illicit removal leaves varied traces. The simplest, most prosaic explanation for missing trophies is misplacement, not conspiracy. The provenance of looted material is notoriously fragile. Unscrupulous dealers obscure origins, and museum acquisition policies in earlier decades were looser than today's. If taphonomic processes account for the lack of bones, the soil chemistry should tell the tale. Acidic soils, high groundwater, or intense bioturbation chew away organic material. Micromorphology and soil pH testing, if they were done, would be the fingerprint for this process. If the field team took soil samples and these survive in a lab or in published appendices, they can be decisive. If those samples are missing, we are back at the archive problem. If archival loss explains the puzzle, the field signal might be clear but orphaned. We might find site plans and photographs in a museum drawer, but no context sheets, radiocarbon dates in a dated journal, but no accession numbers that connect them to specific samples. The archive might show a gap in a particular year or a note that a collection was transferred to another repository. Here, detective work in outside collections, national archives, the private papers of a retired director, international photographic agencies, can yield copies. Suppression is the hardest hypothesis to evaluate. It presumes motivation, political embarrassment, legal liability, or reputational risk. For suppression to be credible, you need documents or testimony that show institutional incentive, a course of actions taken to hide information, and physical evidence inconsistent with official statements. In the absence of such corroboration, suppression remains a speculative possibility and must be treated with appropriate skepticism. A few threads to follow. All of these possibilities turn on documentary anchors. To move from speculation to evidence, we need three types of traces: physical traces in the field, soil chemistry, stratigraphy, features and artifacts, documentary traces, field notebooks, photographs, lab logs, accession registers, and external corroboration, newspaper stories, administrative memos, letters between institutions, or items in private collections. When one of these classes is missing, the other two grow in importance. When two are missing, the case becomes fragile. At this point in the inquiry, there are several investigatory lines that seem both ethical and productive. The first is to search for secondary copies. Photographers sometimes distributed prints to colleagues. Directors sometimes sent slides to teaching collections. Negatives may have been deposited at regional museums. The second is to canvass laboratories that perform radiocarbon and isotopic analyses. Even if the sample identifier is missing, many labs retain run lists and results that can be cross-referenced by date and sample weight. The third is to examine administrative files, permits, correspondence with landowners, and museum accession books often survive in different repositories than field notes and can provide leads. We must also be rigorous about what we do not know. We do not at this stage have evidence pointing conclusively to looting, suppression, or simple misfiling. We do not know who signed the "No Human Remains Found" stamp. We do not know whether the field crew completed context sheets. Speculation is a tool for building hypotheses, not for drawing conclusions. Beginning to weigh hypotheses: evacuation and removal. Let us take two of the possibilities, evacuation and removal, and examine how the comparative cases guide our expectations. Evacuation, as in the Akrotiri example, produces a particular pattern. Domestic features abruptly deserted, food waste and personal effects left in place, and sometimes structural collapse that sealed interiors. The acoustic of abandonment in the record is in situ domesticity. If an archaeological report or photographs show floor assemblages with items like storage jars tilted but intact, or beds preserved under collapse, those are strong signals in favor of evacuation. Importantly, the field record in such a case is usually rich. It is the very negligence of leaving things behind that makes the context archaeologically dense. If the archive for an empty site lacks that richness, if there are no photographs capturing interiors, no context sheets describing floor deposits, evacuation remains possible, but harder to defend. That opens the avenue of looking for external corroboration. Local newspapers or oral history sometimes record an evacuation. Land registry notes may show an abrupt abandonment. If such external materials exist, evacuation remains a leading hypothesis. If external materials are silent, evacuation is a weaker explanation. Removal of remains, either lawful retrieval for reburial or illicit looting, leaves different traces. Legal removals are typically accompanied by permits and transfer documents. There would be a signed receipt at the receiving institution and a record in an accession register. Illicit removal, by contrast, leaves more subtle evidence. Irregularities in context stratigraphy, small trenches cut into finished layers, or a sudden gap in the assemblage where valuable objects were stored. Dealers and collectors might inadvertently create a breadcrumb trail, objects with plausible stylistic attribution, but without a provenance that matches the official record. In wealthy markets, entire collections appear with stereotyped private collection labels and no excavation data. Provenance research, time-consuming but often revealing, can recover these threads. But caution: the presence of unprovenanced items on the market is not proof that the specifically missing archive was intentionally destroyed. It may be that objects from many sites were removed over decades, and administrative changes simply obscured which site they came from. That's why chain of custody and accession numbers are so crucial. If you can find accession numbers that correspond to the missing dig year in a museum ledger, you can trace an object back to the field. If those accession numbers are absent, the trail is cold. At this moment, the evidence we can marshal without further archival work is suggestive but inconclusive. There are analogies that make evacuation plausible. Preserved domestic features on the edge of disaster do exist. There are analogies that make removal plausible. Looting and clandestine exhumation are documented phenomena in many parts of the world. Both avenues demand further documentary corroboration: field photographs, lab receipts, accession books, or even eyewitness accounts. A further complication: institutional incentives. It is worth pausing to note that institutions do not always align in incentives. A university department might prioritize excavation and publication. A national museum might prioritize conservation and display. A local municipality might prioritize tourism. Those differing incentives can create gaps in record keeping. For instance, a university director might return with boxes of artifacts but not simultaneously transfer the field notebooks that would contextualize those objects. The museum might accept objects for storage without pressing for complete context. Over time, the lack of an integrated record system permits orphaning. This is a bureaucratic failure mode, common, human, and often unremarked upon until a question like ours arises. This is also the point at which the insinuation of malfeasance often appears in public imagination. Yet the ordinary bureaucratic explanation, misfiled, mishandled, neglected, should be our default hypothesis because it is common and because it does not require the burdensome proof demanded by accusations of intentional suppression. Still, institutions can and do have incentives to hide embarrassment: legal liability for improper handling of human remains, sensitivity to politically charged fines, or reputational risk from misinterpretation. These are not trivial, but claims that records were intentionally destroyed to conceal wrongdoing demand documentary support. Transfer orders, memos, whistleblower testimony that is not yet available in this case. We should therefore treat suppression as a low probability but high impact hypothesis. It must be considered, but given less weight until corroboration appears. Where we stand and where to look next. At this juncture of the investigation, we've mapped the terrain. We have a clear methodological framework. Absent records mean absent accountability. Absence can be meaningful if we can compare it to analogous cases, and the archival signatures of different mechanisms are distinguishable in principle. We have sketched plausible explanations: evacuation, removal, taphonomic loss, archival accident, and suppression, and begun to articulate the kinds of evidence that would support or refute each. What remains is a patient search through secondary archives, lab logs, accession registers, and local administrative records. The most promising immediate steps are these: to search regional museums and universities for copies of photographs or slides, to query radiocarbon laboratories about run lists from the likely time period, to comb local newspapers and administrative correspondence for references to the excavation season in question, and to trace accession numbers that may have been recorded in separate institutions. Even without access to the focal ledger, one can sometimes triangulate. A set of radiocarbon dates without context might be paired with soil samples or other lab data held in scientific repositories. A set of photographs in a teaching collection might show features and objects that indicate evacuation. A mention in a university minutes book of a transfer to a national museum can point the way to an accession record that was never properly cross-referenced. There is a practical ethical frame that must guide this work. Human remains and the records that describe them belong not merely to scholars but to the communities descended from the people excavated. Any inquiry must thus proceed with respect for privacy, cultural sensitivity, and legal constraints. Where descendant communities exist, their wishes regarding publication, display, and repatriation must weigh heavily on whether and how material is handled. This ethical dimension is not ancillary. It is central to the interpretive work. As we begin to pursue the archival leads, looking into crates, catalogs, run lists, and old correspondence, there is a simple fact that should anchor every step. The archive is not just paper. It is evidence. The absence of evidence is an evidentiary condition in its own right, but only when documented with equal care. In other words, a missing ledger is not merely a lacuna. It is a feature that demands explanation. Does its absence reflect routine administrative drift, a localized disaster, the removal of material, or intentional suppression? Each answer carries different implications for science and for justice. There is one last puzzle to frame before we move deeper into the records. Suppose the archive contains, tucked among unrelated boxes, a set of low-quality contact prints, grainy images of a trench face, a single photo of an empty hearth, a smudged label with a partial date. Those faint traces are the archetypal archaeological supplement, small, partial, but often decisive. They are the kind of evidence that can shift a hypothesis from plausible to probable. Conversely, suppose no secondary repository holds anything relating to that season. That fact, too, is evidence. It increases the likelihood that the papers were destroyed, misfiled en masse, or otherwise lost in a localized event. At this point in the inquiry, the search is methodological and the field of plausible explanations remains broad. The next phase is necessarily archival and forensic, following accession numbers, speaking with conservation departments, querying labs, and seeking the small traces that survive when formal records do not. The questions are precise. Who signed the No Human Remains Found certificate? Did anyone photograph the trench faces? Were samples submitted to laboratories for dating? Where were the bags labeled and sent? Each missing answer increases the uncertainty. Each recovered document narrows it. When an official stamp declares a site empty, and the ledger that should justify that declaration is gone, what you have is not merely a mystery, but a call to method. The silence of documents must be treated as a datum. To unpack that datum, we must be patient, thorough, and ethically attentive. Only then can we begin, with evidence, to choose among evacuation, removal, decay, accident, or suppression as the best explanation for a gap in the record. When an official stamp declares a site empty, and the ledger that should justify that declaration is gone, what you have is not merely a mystery, but a call to method. The silence of documents must be treated as a datum. To unpack that datum, we must be patient, thorough, and ethically attentive. Only then can we begin with evidence to choose among evacuation, removal, decay, accident, or suppression as the best explanation for a gap in the record. So where does an inquiry like this actually start? The first practical move is humility. Admit what you do not know, and then follow the smallest traces. In many cases, the trail is not a dramatic confession, but a series of mundane recoveries. A photograph found in a retired professor's shoebox, a lab run list misfiled under an old project name, an accession number scribbled in the margin of a curator's notebook. Forensic patience is a form of respect both for the scientific method and for the people whose remains, records, and stories might be implicated. Begin with the paperwork that does exist. If a site is stamped, "No Human Remains Found," that stamp must have scribes, dates, and signatures. Identify the signatories. They may have left personal papers, correspondence, travel claims, or departmental memos that mention the season. University minutes often record permissions and transfers. A single line in a departmental ledger, artifacts delivered to museum store, can open a path to accession records. Excavation directors sometimes wrote up interim notes for funders or for the landowner. Scholarships, grant applications, and final reports can all contain cross-references. These are the ordinary, almost boring traces that collectively reconstruct a chain of action. Parallel to documentary searching is scientific triangulation. If the field paperwork is missing, laboratories sometimes preserve the other half of the chain. Radiocarbon facilities maintain run lists, dates, sample weights, and often the sample labels as provided by the submitter. If a lab lists a sample with a site code or a partial accession number, that can anchor a lab result to a missing context sheet. Similarly, osteology laboratories and specialists retain notes and photographs used in assessment. Palynology or sediment specialists may have stored slides or thin sections. In many countries, conservation labs and museum stores keep receipt books for newly arrived crates. Querying these repositories, politely, precisely, and with an awareness of data protection concerns, often yields surprising matches. Next, widen the net to photographic archives. Photographers and teaching collections are a dispersed and surprisingly rich resource. Slides once used in university lectures, contact prints stored with teaching files, or copies of illustrations sent to publishers sometimes survive long after the original negatives were thrown out. Museums occasionally receive duplicate prints from contractors. A handful of sharp, context-rich photographs can substitute for missing field notes more effectively than one might expect. They show object relationships, floor surfaces, and occasionally labels that reveal grid references. Also pursue informal channels. Colleagues reminisce. Local antiquarian societies may have clippings. Hobbyist photographers sometimes documented excavations. Oral histories, interviews with landowners, site laborers, or local residents should be collected with care and properly recorded. They are not by themselves deterministic evidence of context, but in a case where paperwork is absent, they can point investigators to caches, private collectors, or overlooked institutional boxes. While gathering what materials can be found, investigators should build a systematic checklist for evaluating each hypothesis. For every explanatory category, evacuation, removal, taphonomy, archival accident, suppression, ask which independent signatures would be decisive, and which surviving items would be neutral or contradictory. Suppose evacuation is being tested. Decisive signatures include in situ domestic assemblages preserved by collapse or ash, photographic evidence of household items left in place, and, crucially, contemporaneous witness statements describing a hurried departure. Less decisive but suggestive evidence would be an absence of human bone in a context otherwise conducive to preservation, paired with intact household architecture. If none of these elements is found, or if the only remaining traces are post-excavation recollections without supporting material, evacuation becomes harder to support. For removal, whether lawful reburial, transfer for curation, or illicit looting, the decisive evidence differs. A documented permit for exhumation, accession receipts at a receiving institution, or signed transfer documentation are clear indicators of lawful removal. Evidence of clandestine removal would be disturbed fills, compressed or replaced soil, or clandestine trenches observable in the stratigraphy, ideally documented by photographs or measured plans. Market traces, objects emerging in private collections with stylistic attribution but no provenance, can support suspicion of illicit trade, yet they rarely point unambiguously to a specific missing archive unless accession numbers or embargoed labels resurface. Taphonomic explanations demand scientific tests. Soil pH profiles, micromorphology slides, and macrobotanical remains can show environmental regimes hostile to bone survival. If a site's sediments are strongly acidic or waterlogged in ways inconsistent with bone preservation, the absence of skeletal material shifts from puzzling to expected. Conversely, if preserved organics exist elsewhere in similar layers but no bone is present where it should be, taphonomy is an incomplete explanation. At Atapuerca, microtraces, cut marks, percussion scars, made the difference between interpretations. In our titular puzzle, The absence of such microtraces may simply reflect a failure to record them, which circles back to the archive. Archival accident produces its own signatures. Misfiling tends to scatter related materials under different identifiers. Transfers without proper inventory leave a paper trail of handoffs lacking itemized lists. Disasters, fires, floods, leave institutional records noting loss and claims for insurance. A cluster of missing files linked by a single transfer date or a recorded flood is a different phenomenon from isolated gaps. In the best-case scenario, one finds an administrative note. Boxes sent to central stores, contents not listed, or negatives misplaced during move. These bureaucratic confessions are unglamorous but often explanatory. Suppression claims require the highest bar. To treat suppression as credible, we need three things: motive, means, and documentary corroboration. Motive could be legal liability, political sensitivity, or reputational risk. Means would be access to the boxes and the power to refile, destroy, or otherwise divert them. Corroboration requires independent witnesses, email trails, memos, or anomalies in inventory indicating deliberate removal. Absent such corroboration, suppression should remain a last resort hypothesis because it supplants ordinary explanations with extraordinary claims. Weighing these possibilities is not just an intellectual exercise. It shapes how investigators act. If archival accident is the leading hypothesis, one focuses on catalog systems, cross-referencing old accession ledgers, and searching related collections. If taphonomy is plausible, one prioritizes soil samples and any surviving eco-factual material. If removal seems likely, provenance research and market surveillance become priorities. Each line of inquiry uses different tools and expertise: archivists, conservation scientists, prosecutorial advisors, or community liaison officers. There are also temporal layers to consider. If the excavation occurred decades ago, institutional memory may have eroded, key actors may have retired or died, documentation standards may have been lax, and physical media, negatives, paper records, magnetic tapes, may have degraded. That weakness is a factor in favor of archival accident simply because the passage of time correlates with greater opportunity for loss. Yet it is precisely these older projects where oral histories and retired staff holdings matter most. Letters framed for retirement or for heirs can contain slides and notes rescued from institutional purges. As we pursue evidence, ethical obligations accumulate. Where human remains are potentially involved, the very thing an empty declaration addresses, descendant communities, local authorities, and legal frameworks must inform the pace and transparency of inquiry. If the remains were reburied or repatriated, their current custodians may have rights and sensitivities that preclude public disclosure of certain details. Investigators must therefore coordinate with cultural leaders and legal counsel before publishing sensitive material. Respect, not curiosity, must be the default posture. It is worth pausing for a procedural example. Imagine an investigator finds a lab run list with 3 radiocarbon dates from the right year, bearing an ambiguous site code. The lab lists sample weights and the submitter's name, but no accession number matching any known catalog. The next steps are clear. Contact the lab for raw data and chain of custody paperwork. Trace the submitter to their institutional affiliation. Search that institution for project files with the same submitter and year, and cross-reference teaching slides and conference abstracts from the period. This kind of stepwise work, lab to submitter to institution to slides to accession, register, often resolves puzzles not by single dramatic revelations, but by cumulative matches. Another common outcome is the recovery of partial documentation: a contact print with a legible grid tag, a context sheet with a corner missing, a typed final report that mentions samples submitted to Laboratory X without identifiers. Partial recovery can shift probabilistic weight dramatically. A contact print that shows intact domestic features, for example, pushes evacuation higher on the list of plausible explanations. A context sheet indicating no bones observed, tied to a soil analysis showing highly acidic conditions, bolsters a taphonomic interpretation. Partials are legitimate victories, not the final word, but powerful evidence. Throughout, comparative cases remain instructive. Akrotiri teaches us to look for in situ household arrangements. The hypogeum reminds us that social practice matters as much as science. Tallandman warns us that exceptional preservation can produce counterintuitive expectations. Grandolina shows how micro-evidence can overturn grand narratives. East Smithfield demonstrates the effect of crisis on recording. These analogies help investigators know what to seek in the fragments that survive. After months of patient archival work, what would count as resolution? There are a few possible endpoints that carry different implications. The most satisfying resolution is documentary reconciliation. Radiocarbon run lists matched to accession numbers. Context sheets matched to photographs. Transfer memos that document lawful reburial or legitimate transfer. That kind of outcome restores both scientific confidence and institutional accountability. A second possible but still acceptable outcome is probabilistic closure. The preponderance of evidence consistently supports one hypothesis, say archival accident plus taphonomic loss, without ever producing a single smoking gun. Science often proceeds by accumulation of probability rather than absolute proof. In such cases, transparent reporting of methods, evidence, and remaining uncertainties is essential. A third outcome, less satisfying but possible, is persistent ambiguity. No photographs are found, lab archives are missing, oral sources are contradictory, and museum accession books show gaps that cannot be reconciled. In this scenario, the ethical response is to record the absence carefully, publish the null result with full documentation of searches undertaken, and to recommend institutional reforms to prevent repetition. An honest catalog of absence is itself a form of accountability. Finally, a small number of cases move toward evidence of malfeasance. Here, investigators may uncover emails describing the deliberate removal of files, receipts indicating cash payments for artifacts, or testimony from staff corroborating improper disposal. When such evidence appears, legal and ethical protocols must be followed. Involve the appropriate authorities, respect legal processes, and protect whistleblowers. But even then, claims must be supported by documentation and sensational narratives avoided. What in the end is the most defensible assessment when you begin with a stamped "No human remains found" and an empty archive? In the absence of corroborating evidence, the most cautious, methodologically honest position is probabilistic humility. Administrative failure and archival loss are common, time-honored explanations that fit many observed patterns of missing material. Evacuation and taphonomic loss are often plausible explanations supported by well-known analogs. Removal, both lawful and illicit, is also credible in many regions and periods. Suppression is possible, but should be treated as a low-probability hypothesis until corroborated. That sober judgment does not satisfy the appetite for narrative closure, but the discipline of archaeology and the ethical treatment of human remains are built on the patience of evidence, not the theatrics of suspicion. There is power in admitting uncertainty, and in laying out precisely what evidence would change one's mind. So what should institutions and the public learn from a case like this? First, archival stewardship matters. Budgetary decisions that relegate field notes, negatives, and context sheets to the periphery invite exactly the lacunae that produce long-standing mysteries. Digitization is not a panacea, but it reduces single points of failure. Comprehensive accessioning policies that require linked documentation for every object transferred between entities give future researchers a fighting chance at reconstruction. Second, transparency builds trust. When institutions proactively publish transfer records, accession logs, and inventory checklists, they do more than preserve data. They demonstrate good faith to descendant communities and the public. Third, legal and ethical frameworks need teeth. Clear channels for reporting, investigating, and remedying archival loss or suspicious disposals are essential to deter negligent or malicious behavior. There is also a role for the public and for the curious. Crowdsourced archival hunts, properly managed, can be remarkably effective. Historians and amateur collectors have sometimes supplied missing photographic prints or fragments of correspondence that professional offices overlooked. But public engagement must be handled carefully. Data protection, privacy, and ethical concerns about human remains require that citizen efforts be coordinated with institutions and community advocates. As for the people whose lives and bodies stand behind these records, the descendants, the communities whose heritage is at stake, their stake is primary. Any search, any recovery, any eventual display or publication must be governed by consultation and consent where applicable. The archive is not merely an academic resource. It is a repository of memory and of claims. When the ledger is empty and the boxes are gone, the case becomes a test of civic and professional responsibility. It asks whether institutions will look for their own ghosts with rigor, whether scientists will privilege evidence over speculation, and whether communities will be treated as partners rather than obstacles. It is, in its quiet way, a moral as well as an intellectual puzzle. So where does that leave us with the particular image that began this investigation? A padlocked gate, an official stamp reading "No human remains found," and an archive with a hole in the drawer. It leaves us with pathways rather than answers. It leaves us with a clear investigative agenda. Identify signatories and submitters. Query radiocarbon and specialist laboratories for run lists. Comb photographic and teaching archives. Search accession ledgers and transfer memos. Conduct soil analyses where possible. And above all, consult descendant communities. It also leaves us with a hierarchy of explanations weighted by ordinary patterns of human error and natural process, rather than by conspiratorial imagination. If you are following this inquiry and want the supporting documents, notes on sources, and a curated dossier of the comparative cases mentioned here, Akrotiri, the Hal Safliani Hypogam, Talandman, Atapuerca, the Taung Child's Discovery, Lula Ilaco, and the East Smithfield Burials, you can find links and references in the companion dossier. It contains bibliographic notes, suggestions for further reading on taphonomy and archival practice, and resources for supporting better preservation of excavation records. A stamped "No human remains found" paired with missing records will remain for some time a compelling and unsettling story, but the unease is precisely the right response. It should prod institutions to better stewardship, researchers to careful methods, and the public to insist on transparency. Absence, when documented and interrogated, can teach us as much as presence. The task is to turn that unsettling silence into responsible inquiry, methodical, patient, and respectful, so that future generations inherit not a drawer of shadows, but a preserved, accountable archive of the past.